In this election year, one of the hottest topics being talked about is inequality. It's an issue that seems to be increasingly relevant because of the growing levels of economic inequality in the United States. And there are scores of great studies, articles, and videos much like this one detailing the current state of economic inequality and how it's evolved, so it's not my goal to rehash the information you could find somewhere else. But to quickly summarize, in the words of Nicholas Bloom, a Stanford economist, I don't know any serious economist who would deny that inequality has gone up. The debate is over the magnitude, not the direction. So, safely assuming that economic inequality is on the rise, both in relevance and absolute levels, there's something more interesting going on, and it's the way in which the current of thought surrounding inequality has begun to flow. Put simply, there's a shift occurring. People in the intellectual and policymaking communities are starting to talk about inequality differently, which is especially significant because they are in the best position to affect it. So, what exactly is going on? To start, let's consider things from a theoretical level. In a market-based economy, inequality is inevitable. Resources and skills are valued differently, so those who possess the most highly valued ones will be able to attract more money in return for them. It's the reason that highly sought-after paintings can fetch a $300 million price tag, while something painted by me would struggle to find any takers even if I offered it for free. Thus, inequality is ultimately a political question. How much inequality are we as a society willing to tolerate? What measures will policymakers take to influence the distribution? So, if we are concerned about, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, where we are and whither we are tending as regards inequality, then it's essential to understand how inequality is understood among those policy-making bodies and the organizations that intellectually influence them. If that's the story we're interested in, we should start with the last big paradigm shift, neoliberalism. So what happened? Well, as Stephen Nelson, a political scientist at Northwestern, discusses, in the late 1970s, the old guard of the economic intellectual community was populated by Keynesians. And that essentially means that they're individuals who followed the teachings of John Maynard Keynes and, in general, accepted some role for government action in economic management. However, as time wore into the 80s, they were replaced by younger American-educated economists who were less willing to accept state intervention in the economy. Kenneth Rogoff, formerly chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, summarized this neoliberal ethos succinctly: market-based solutions to problems. So how did this government minimalist ideology relate to inequality? Part of economists' thought about inequality was that, actually, it could be a good thing. This may sound bizarre at first, but really this is just recognizing the way that inequality can structure or reflect incentives. Angus Deaton, the winner of last year's Nobel Prize in Economics, put it, inequality is partly a marker of success. If someone thinks of something, some new innovation that benefits us all, and the market works properly, they get richly rewarded for that, and that's just terrific. And that creates inequality. Researchers at the IMF put it more bluntly. Some inequality is integral to the effective functioning of a market economy and the incentives needed for investment and growth. But more than anything else, economists just didn't really concern themselves with inequality. Their chief object was growth, with the familiar analogy, a rising tide raises all boats. Taking measures to reduce inequality would screw up the incentives and be harmful to growth. Robert Lucas, another Nobel Prize winner, summed it up. Of the tendencies that are harmful to sound economics, the most seductive and poisonous is to focus on questions of distribution. The practical result of this hands-off prescription for government was predictable. Looking at a graph of the national incomes held by the top 1% over time reveals a notable uptick in the share those wealthiest citizens took home, beginning in the 80s, the same time this neoliberal logic was permeating the economic community. Undoubtedly, this increasing stratification is due, at least in part, to government unwillingness to redistribute. And though inequality has increased more or less steadily through to the present day, the neoliberal mode of thinking has begun to change. Three major events responsible for this shift, the first and most important of which was the global financial crisis. Before the meltdown, rapidly inflating real estate bubbles and freely flowing credit was able to take some of the sting off inequality. Sure, the distribution of wealth may be massively skewed, but hey, we're all getting richer, so who cares, right? Of course, when the bubble popped and credit markets ground to a halt, the American public, a good many of them losing their homes in foreclosure, became unsurprisingly incensed at the eye-popping paychecks drawn by corporate executives. More broadly, the crisis represented a serious indictment of American-style neoliberal economic management. For someone taking stock in, say, 2010, it seemed that this minimalist government ideology had allowed some firms to engage in unrestricted, risky business practices that ultimately destroyed the economy. To many, it appeared that Wall Street and corporate America, left to their own devices, got rich by gambling with the entire global economy, and then by and large managed to jump ship when the trouble hit, their riches mostly intact, while poor and middle class individuals lost their homes or their retirements. By exposing the vulnerability of neoliberalism, the meltdown prompted a reassessment of what constituted proper economic management. In an interview earlier this month, Maurice Obstfeld, the current chief economist of the IMF, said, "It's fair to say that the shock of the global financial crisis led to a broad rethink of macroeconomic and financial policy in the global academic and policy community. That process has not fundamentally changed the core of our approach, but it has added some important insights about how to best achieve those results in a sustainable way." The second significant event was closely related to the first, the Occupy Wall Street movement. Though it's described as incoherent and ephemeral, there's no doubt that it launched discussions of economic inequality into the political mainstream. As Richard Thaler, a University of Chicago economist and president of the American Economic Association, remarked at the end of 2015, "It's pretty much indisputable that the income being earned by the top 1% is going up. It was true 5 years ago, but it was not as widely recognized." It's unsurprising that the intense societal focus on inequality coincided with a renewed academic focus on the subject. A topic that was formerly at the fringe of the intellectual community was moving to its heart. Stephen Fazari, an economist at Washington University in St. Louis, commented on the shift. "In the last few years, there's been a huge change in the mainstream of the profession. The issue of income inequality was a backwater in the economics field, and it was largely ignored." The third major event was the emergence of an economics superstar, or at least as close as one can come to superstar status while talking about historical patterns of labor income and national wealth shares. Thomas Piketty, a French economist, had spent much of his career focused on issues of inequality, but when in 2014 he published Capital in the 21st Century, the book was a smash hit and he became an overnight sensation. The work itself is rather dense, clocking in at over 700 pages, but its key argument created lots of buzz. That not only was inequality inherent, but that it was structurally reinforcing. Wealth from capital, i.e., being the owner of the company, grew faster than wealth from fixed wage labor, i.e., being the employee. While significant debate still ensues over whether his analysis is sound or not, one of its undisputed effects has been to signify that inequality is the hot topic in economics, and to further intensify research into the sources of inequality and its effects. To see how thought has evolved in the post-financial crisis years, it's helpful to consider a case study: the International Monetary Fund. As Stephen Nelson highlights in his research, the IMF is especially important as an organization in the academic community, primarily because it's perceived as an authority whose judgments are seen as legitimate and reflecting expert knowledge. In addition to that powerful ability to set the norms of what constitutes appropriate policy, its favorable treatment of countries who closely match its ideological preference creates an additional force pushing its norms and sidelining its detractors all across the globe. The IMF has many publications that, while ultimately expressing only the views of the authors and not necessarily the fund as an organization, are useful in gauging what subjects are important within the IMF and how they're talked about. Thus, we can trace them as reflections of how the discussion of inequality is changing more broadly. A 2011 piece from two senior researchers, Jonathan Ostry and Andrew Berg, at the IMF, examines sustainable growth in developing countries. Sustainable growth meaning long periods of continuous economic growth, not short, flash-in-the-pan growth that quickly fizzles out. They found that lower levels of inequality within a country were associated with longer, more durable growth periods. In fact, they found inequality to have one of the strongest effects on the predicted length of a growth spell out of all the possible explanations they examined. However, because of the many other variables at work and the possibility for unintended negative consequences, they caution it's nonetheless necessary to be cautious about what sorts of policies can be recommended based on the evidence presented here. In 2014, a publication by the same two researchers as well as one additional contributor found two important results. The first was that inequality had a significant negative impact on the rate of economic growth. Secondly, contrary to the conventional suggestion of economic theory, they found no evidence that engaging in redistribution of income was harmful to growth. Building on that result, another group of researchers put out findings the next year that focused not just on levels of inequality generally, but on specific changes to the distribution of incomes within a country. They found that increasing the income share held by the top 20% of earners had a small negative effect on growth. On the contrary, they found that increasing the share held by the bottom 20% had a positive one. As an example, they found that if the bottom quintile went from holding, say, 10% of the nation's income to holding 11%, that would translate to an almost 0.4% increase in the overall level of economic growth. Taken together, these two publications suggest that policy approaches can both reduce levels of inequality and still promote growth. Specifically, quote, redistribution through the tax and transfer system is found to be positively related to growth for most countries, end quote. This all culminates in an article from earlier this month called Neoliberalism Oversold that has been making quite a few waves. In it, three senior IMF officials examine some of the policies of the neoliberal ethos and conclude the benefits in terms of increased growth seem fairly difficult to establish. The costs in terms of increased inequality are prominent. Increased inequality in turn hurts the level and sustainability of growth. They conclude by saying, these findings suggest a need for a more nuanced view of what the neoliberal agenda is likely to achieve. The IMF has been at the forefront of this reconsideration. So, what exactly should we make of all of this? Well, for one, we can't exaggerate the reality of what's happening. This is not a sudden turn to Marxism. The intellectual economic community is not going to abandon a general belief in the wisdom and efficiency of private competitive markets. It is, as Obstfeld at the IMF said, evolution, not revolution. Yet, there's still an important shift going on. The old hands-off consensus is breaking down. Growth still remains the chief goal for those in the economic community, but inequality was once on the fringe. Focus on growing the size of the whole pie instead of worrying about the size of each piece that someone got. Now inequality is at the heart of the conversation, in large part because of a growing body of evidence that it is actually harmful to growth. The flaws of neoliberalism, exemplified by the global financial crisis and rising inequality, suggest that perhaps there's a greater place for the state in economic management. Though we'll undoubtedly continue to look to those market solutions to problems, sometimes solutions might come from government. At the end of the day, if we're concerned about inequality, whether because of justice considerations or the newly evident economic ones, we should be encouraged by this emerging logic. As this fresh discussion around inequality continues to evolve, it seems more likely that the eventual conclusions will demand some policy to reduce it.